Hello and welcome back to Code to Cloud. And I'm your host as always, Kevin Evans. And today I am joined by Chad Crowell. Crowell?
That's right.
Nearly, I didn't butcher it,
You
right?
got
I
it.
hope not. I hope not, right? But yeah,
Yeah.
and we're going to be talking about how to ace the Certified Kubernetes Admin exam, right? Which I was saying to Chad just before we kicked off this recording. It's something I've failed miserably at, right? And I need to go back at it, right? And it was a real eye opener, right? And I'm not going to steal any of Chad's thunder, but I think it's really important that people understand what they're getting themselves into when they go after one of these Kubernetes exams, right? So, Chad, you just want to introduce yourself quickly? I know you're rocking the famous K8 hoodie there, right? From the Cloud Native Foundation, right? So, yeah.
Yep. My name is Chad Crowell. I work as a platform engineer for Civo Cloud. And I am also a CNCF ambassador. I'm a Kubernetes contributor. And what else am I? I'm a speaker. I'm an author. And I have this platform called KubeSkills, which helps people skill up on containers and Kubernetes. And yeah, just have a passion for learning Kubernetes, teaching Kubernetes, and learning new and interesting ways to deploy applications on Kubernetes and in a distributed fashion. So
really the whole 9 yards there, Chad. Like, I think I need to check out that KubeSkills platform. I think I need a bit of that in my life. Maybe I'll pass the exam, right? But yeah, really, really great to have you on. I think we should try and start at the beginning, right, of why people would want to look at this exam, right? It's quite a technical exam, yeah. And maybe what kind of skills would you need? Because when I first started looking at this a few years ago, I just compared it to the rest of the exams in the ecosystem, but that doesn't mean it was the right thing to do, right? So what are your thoughts on that, right? Where would people get started and why should they try and take this exam?
Yeah, this is the kind of midpoint in the 5 now total Kubernetes exams in the CNCF ecosystem, if you will. A lot of people ask this question, and it's a good question. Where do I start? What are the prerequisites? I will say the exam is $395 US. That's not anything that anybody's going to pay out of pocket. I highly encourage you to ask your boss if if you are going for the exam to pay for that very high ticket price, especially when you compare it to the AWS Solutions Architect Associate. And I think most of the Microsoft exams now have gone down in price significantly. So yeah, it's nothing to it's nothing to kind of pass off as a simple, kind of easy exam to get and to pass and to pay for. So I'll start off with that. So that gives you an idea of who is going to be taking this exam, right? It's going to be you are in an industry where you're already working with cloud or containers or in a DevOps engineer or maybe even a Linux administrator. So that's kind of the area, the background where people come from mostly. And this is going to prepare you for, running applications and maintaining applications in a production scenario. The prerequisites, based on what I just said, is that you have to know Linux, you have to know Docker, and what problem containers solve in the grand scheme of things, and what Kubernetes adds to that in terms of being a container orchestration platform. What does that mean, right? So as you use Docker and you run containers locally, maybe using Docker Desktop, how can you expand upon that and scale your applications so that you have multiple, possibly even hundreds of pods running as a part of one application, or how to separate those using networking, etc. So it's very much an exam that a practitioner would take.
Okay. The prerequisites, right? I'd like to touch on them a little bit because, like, even I tripped up, right? I've been using Linux since I'm getting old now, Chad. I think it was 12 when I started using Red Hat, right? Back in the day. And I've always been a Nano guy, right? And people are like, what's Nano? And it's a text editor, right? It's built into most Unix, Linux platforms. But there's another one, right? Which has got a bit of a legendary status, right? Which is Vim. And
Yeah.
that itself has its own set of skills, and it's just a simple text editor, right? So learning how to change, I believe most of the configuration files are YAML, right? YAML files, right?
Yep.
In Kubernetes land, right? So learning how to do things by hand, I think back to your point of this is a technically intense certification, right? And career path, right? Which most people relish the challenge. That's why they choose this, right? Because it's not a virtual machine, right? It's not hosting it on another hypervisor or another cloud platform. It's actually, you got to think about it, right? And to your point with the high ticket price on the cert, 2 tips, because obviously I run a CNCF meetup as well, and Black Friday's a good day for getting that exam at a reduced price, and also speak to your CNCF rep, your local meetup. They may be able to get you a discount as well. But to your point, right, Chad, go and ask your boss, right? If it's going to serve you in your day-to-day work, right, go and ask your boss, right? So, but yeah, how many years experience would you say someone would need? That's probably a better way of quantifying it, right? So, and I know it varies, right? I've seen students that have never touched a production environment pass this exam, right? But then, that's all they've done at home, right? Is build labs, right? Or done Kubernetes the hard way or whatever, right? But how many years experience would you sort of recommend for people to take this exam if they're looking at doing this?
Yeah, good question. That's also another question that I get a lot. I do want to touch on one thing that you said before about, using Vim versus Nano. That is so important because this exam is entirely hands-on. So you're given a terminal, you're literally RDP'd or have a remote desktop connection to a Linux desktop in which you can only use the things on that Linux desktop. So terminal, you have Mozilla Firefox. There's all these things that are configured with that desktop that you have to use. So you can't use your own browser. You can't use bookmarks, etc.
Right.
So that's an important thing to highlight, I think, because this is a lot different than any other exam. Being that you're actually performing the commands in the terminal to score points on the exam, and those points accumulate to either a pass or fail. So going back to your question about how many years you should have experience, I think I've seen people come at this from a lot of different angles. The official recommendation is, I think, 2 years of production experience, but
Right.
I would say that's a bit of a a bit of a kind of a broad, or not a broad estimation, but a it's a little bit kind of safe, I guess. I would say you should be familiar and have enough practice so you can become familiar with kubectl is the biggest one.
Right.
Systemd and using systemctl for services on a Linux system, and also kubelet, kubeadm, and the just the components that consist of the of Kubernetes. So the controller manager, the scheduler, those things that exist that allow Kubernetes to run. So those are the things that I would say you would have to have at least 6 months if you're really diligent about it, you could get that experience, or kind of start that daily practice of using those tools, and going through exercises and challenges. And I would say you could do it within 6 months if you have that Linux Docker container background. So I've seen it done in 6 months, but that's kind of the breaking point, or the bare minimum, I would say. It can be done, but it takes very diligent practice, and you have to be very disciplined.
So those tools you were talking about, right? They're the command line tools, right? That make up parts of the Kubernetes ecosystem, right? So they've all got their own, I'm going to show my age here, a set of switches, right? That come with it, right? But yeah, there's more to it, right? Than just kubectl, to your point, right? You need to know how the Linux operating system works, right? To a certain level. And if you've been a Windows guy all your life, like I was, that can be a bit of a shock, right? When you first look at that kind of thing, right? But again, I still think it's introducing skill sets that people need to learn, right? Because most cloud workloads now are on Linux in some way or form, right? So yeah. To your point though about the exam, it's like an RDP session, right?
Yeah.
Is there a particular version of Linux that they use, or is it like Ubuntu, or are they using some crazy version? Because I know
It's a Debian based OS, so it's going to be using like the apt package manager to install and update kubelet, kubectl, and kubeadm, for example. And then the desktop itself is like a GNOME like, or XFCE type desktop, Linux desktop.
Okay, maybe it might be good for folks to go and get one deployed somewhere, right? So they can get used to it if they've never used it before.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, there's this excellent kind of exam simulator that actually comes with your exam voucher. So it is free if you purchase the exam,
right?
But it's provided by Killer Shell, and you can just open up a new browser tab and type killer.sh, and they provide a wonderful, almost exact replica of the exam. They call it the exam simulator. It's very does do a good job of simulating the exam. So check that out if you're not necessarily, if you don't have the resources to spin up your own Linux VM or what have you. I like to suggest that, just because people ask me, what should I build? What should I have in place to practice? And I don't want people to get distracted with going through Kubernetes the hard way, for example, or building a whole environment in their home lab. I think it's more important to focus on using the environments that you have, or have have at your disposal through either a cloud environment, or in this case Killer Shell. Utilize those services, because it's going to help. It's going to help you overall. It's going to take you less time to prepare. It's going to eliminate distractions, right? Because you want to get to kind of practicing as much as you can, going through those scenarios, going through those those exercises, getting in the reps, so to speak. And I try to have people not get distracted with building environments, building VMs, etc.
I mean, that's a good call, because when I started off on my journey of this about 2.5 years ago,
yeah,
it was a very complex ecosystem to get my head around. And everybody I spoke to, right, online or whatever, right, in the community, had their own spin on things, right? And even like to your point, just Docker, right? Just how does that work into this, right? Like trying to figure out where things land in the ecosystem. And I have this phrase that I use, right, whenever I'm doing talks or I'm speaking to my clients, like, what do I need to know for my job, right? Taking something that big and concising it down, right? So to your point, try and just use the labs, right, that are in these, that are available to you as part of the certification, because it's the closest thing you're going to get, right? Because if you start building it yourself, it's going to be your own variation or somebody else's variation. There's an opinion about everything, right? So
yeah, I always recommend both the Killer Shell and Killer Coda, Killer and then CODA.com, which provides you with a Kubernetes lab environment for free. So between those two resources, that's really all that you need.
Okay. Is there any books that you might recommend?
I do have a book. I do hesitate to advertise the book.
Well, I asked, right? So
I do hesitate to advertise the book because there's going to be some exam changes, which perhaps we'll get into in a second.
Yep.
But the book is going to be outdated as of November 25th, 2024. So I don't want to mislead people in thinking that if they're taking the exam after November 25th, that they will have all that they need. I used to be able to say that this book is all that you need, and certainly if you're taking the exam before November 25th, that's the case. But I have this book called Acing the Certified Kubernetes Administrator Exam, and it's mostly exercises on purpose because, like I said, it's going to take putting those reps in to pass this exam and get the experience that you need in order to, not freeze up on exam day and wonder what kubectl command am I supposed to run. So that's it's over 70 exam exercises that get you in that practice. So it's less theory. It's not an introductory to Kubernetes book. It's more of a, how do I actually ace this exam?
Pass the exam, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Again, I mean, it comes back to that theory of mine. What do I need to know for my job? What do I need to know to pass this exam, right?
Exactly.
So what changes are coming up? Is there any boogeymen in the closet that we should be worried about, right? Because I know they like to keep things creative, right? And let's be honest, this platform, right, this orchestration platform evolves on a monthly, if not quarterly basis, right? It's got a high release roadmap. So is there anything, what's your top three, right, that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, and by the way, this exam hasn't changed in years. This is the biggest change, I think, in maybe 3 or 4 years that is underway. The version of Kubernetes does change. I think that's, you said, it's a fast-paced release cycle. They do release 3 times a year. So the version of Kubernetes does change, which sometimes changes the underlying API resources, but for the most part, it hasn't changed in terms of what's required to know for the exam. So this is quite large. It's kind of a big deal, and I would like to talk about the main differences. And the biggest thing that we should focus on is the fact that these exam changes are not random. They're not, at the whim. They don't do this lightly. It's for good measure and for good reasons. This is just to keep up with the, what an average, I guess you could say, or what a standard Kubernetes cluster looks like today. And
Right.
I think the biggest shift in what we're seeing is Kubernetes being used less for an infrastructure tool and more for kind of at the API level or the application level. And what I mean by that is, you see less people building their own Kubernetes distribution or building a Kubernetes cluster from scratch than you do, or from an administrator standpoint, than you do have a requirement to deal with the CRDs, for example, or the operators that exist on utilizing the extensibility of Kubernetes, etc. So I think that's the main kind of shift in what we're seeing in both this exam and also the industry is that we're utilizing Kubernetes in a different way. So the exam is changing in line with that, which is good.
Okay, moving with the times, right?
Yeah. So having said that, I think the biggest changes you'll see is well, let's talk about what they're removing from the exam. Perhaps this would be, start with the positives, right? What will you not have to know anymore for the exam? And that really comes down to backing up and restoring etcd. So this is no longer a requirement in the it's 25%, this section of the exam, which is called cluster architecture, installation, and configuration. That's 25% of the exam.
Right.
So it's a good chunk. So they've removed backing up and restoring etcd from that, being that in a day-to-day, I think, yes, you, as a Kubernetes administrator, you're backing up etcd, but you're not using manual efforts to do that. There's a lot of services that are available now to, take a backup, store that in an S3 bucket somewhere or what have you. So they've taken that out of the exam because it's not really a core skill set that's needed to be a Kubernetes administrator. So that's good because it was kind of a really hard concept to grasp for many folks. I think going through, I run a CKA boot camp, and we're actually in the middle of one right now. We just finished up a class today, actually, and in the boot camp, we're running this boot camp for the fourth time now, and every time the etcd portion of the book always trips people up because etcd has its own server certificate, so you must provide authentication to access it, rightfully so. But it throws people off because they're not familiar with PKI and kind of how certificates work in Kubernetes. So that's no longer a requirement. So that's huge. So that's the time savings there.
It's good to know because certificates, right? I don't know about you, but in my professional life, it's never been easy, right? No matter what platform, right? So,
Yeah.
that sounds like a good win there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge kind of weight lifted, and but well, let's finish up the removed before we get into what's being added. So also using kubeadm to installing kubeadm. Kubeadm is the kind of the Kubernetes distribution, if you will. So you can bootstrap Kubernetes and build your cluster using kubeadm. That's still going to be the case, being that it's still utilizing that mechanism to build the cluster. And by the way, those clusters will be provided for you on the exam. There's no build a cluster using kubeadm on the exam, and there certainly won't be after the change as well. But you're no longer using kubeadm to update components. So a lot of in the book, I brought people through using kubeadm to upgrade the control plane, the API, the controller manager, the scheduler, and core DNS and etcd. You no longer are required to do that. So they removed that that kind of administration feature, I should say, from the exam. They
Right.
do, however, say create and manage Kubernetes clusters using kubeadm. So there's a little bit of obscurity there. So I'll say that still be familiar that it's there, and that in fact on the exam day you're going to be using a kubeadm cluster, but I would say just be less familiar with how to update kubeadm itself and to upgrade the control plane components. So that's what's being removed, and kind of to connect that back to what I was saying before about the changes in the industry. As a Kubernetes administrator, a lot of times, I mean, I don't know a lot of production environments that are using kubeadm. I'm sure they're out there, and but in a lot of production scenarios, we're using either EKS, AKS, or GKE, or we're using some version of Rancher, whether it be RKE2 or K3S. We use K3S in Civo land, but yeah, that I think that is. I think it's is kind of a nod to why they're making that change, removing the etcd and the kubeadm stuff from the exam.
Yeah, I think that's the only time I've ever seen it is when people are trying to do it bare metal by themselves on premise, right? And they build their own clusters, but most cloud service providers, they've got their own flavor, right? And they take care of that piece for you, like you said, right? So
yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of companies use the especially smaller companies, they use the managed Kubernetes service. I think from a Kubernetes administrator standpoint, and you have very much less administration to do if you've kind of handed over the control plane to the cloud vendor, right? So for the purposes of the exam, they're testing you on you are going to be responsible for managing those control plane components. So that's probably why they use kubeadm, and probably why you're being tested in a different way and managing not only the worker nodes, but the control plane as well.
awesome.
So moving into the additions, which are probably the biggest shock and biggest thing to.
How many have we got in total?
Well, it's not so much the amount as it is the whole new kind of understanding that you have to have to be able to pass this exam. It's kind of a heavy lift. So it's a deep set of knowledge, not individual pieces of knowledge that you have to know. So what I mean by that is, for example, in the cluster architecture, installation, and configuration, yes, they've removed, backing up and restoring etcd, but they've added understanding CRDs, and you actually have to be familiar with how to install and configure operators. So for those who don't know, CRDs are custom resource definitions, and those CRDs, the operators that get installed, the most common operator, or one of the most common operators, is the Prometheus operator, which most people may have, or some people may have used, and would be good to practice on for this exam, by the way. Give you the ability to use CRDs to create resources that are specific to Prometheus, like the node exporter, the Prometheus UI, for example. So those are the types of CRDs that they're talking about for this exam, which is a huge thing. Like operators are not a small it's not a small thing. It's a huge undertaking to learn how operators work, the operator framework, Cube Builder. That's a whole separate realm of understanding, right?
Sounds like I need to go on one of your boot camps, Chad. Already, I'm.
Yeah, not trying to scare people here, but it is.
Oh no, but again, it's another set of skills that you'll be able to scale, right? So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and again, this is going back to what I said at the very beginning. It's like this is what the industry is headed towards, or in a lot of cases it's already there. So you're gonna, 9 out of every 10 Kubernetes administrators, DevOps engineers, platform engineers, whatever you want to call them, they are going to be responsible for, at the very least, maintaining operators and the CRDs that come with those operators. So it makes sense, but it's yeah, it's a different. It's a pretty, pretty heavy thing to, not a heavy thing. It takes a lot of learning to understand, wrap your head around it. But along with that, in that same section of the exam, so 25% again, cluster architecture, installation, configuration. Not only CRDs and operators, we have using customize. So we've always used. So in the old version of the exam, it said, what did it say? Provision. Okay, so it said, I'm reading through the kind of current
Accurate
version of
information. I like it.
So I came prepared, but I'm trying to find the part that it was very obscure. That it okay. So it said awareness of manifest management and common templating tools. Very, very obscure, I think.
What does
Awareness
that
of
mean, Chad?
Yeah. So I mean, we always took that to mean Helm and manifest management. So how you manage your manifests, which are all those YAML files that you have to create Kubernetes resources. You can package those up and use a package manager in Kubernetes called Helm. And so we took that to mean Helm in terms of managing those manifests, and also common templating tools. So common or templating tools, meaning you can also use Helm to templatize using values files those applications as a part of your Helm chart. So that's what I've always took it as, and have never really heard an instance of it being outside of Helm up until now. So now they actually specify, instead of saying awareness of manifest management and common templating tools, they say use Helm and customize. So they're calling out those specific tools to install cluster components.
Well, at least you know where you need to land now, right?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of a difference between those tools. So I am glad that they're more specific and not using that obscure language. But customize is a totally different thing than Helm. So that's an important add-on to the exam.
Okay.
And then going over to the services and networking.
My favorite section.
Going over to that section, we have so in the old. So I wish I could do like a side-by-side here, and perhaps I'll provide that resource for people to look at after they listen to this podcast. But in the old version of the, current version, I should say, the version up until November 25th, in the services and networking section, which is 20%, they said another kind of obscure language. They said, understand host networking configuration on the cluster nodes.
Understand host networking configuration on the cluster nodes, right?
Yeah, understand host networking configuration. Very obscure, right? And the new version, and the version after November 25th, they said, define and enforce network policies.
Yes.
So I think that's better language. I like the highlighting network policies. Network policies have always been used on the exam, but it's never been as clear as it is now that it's going to be used. So I'm glad that they got more specific. And then also a complete edition. So very, very new to the section. Again, this is the same section, services and networking. Use Gateway API to manage ingress traffic. So Gateway API is a popular kind of ingress mechanism, if you will, that's used alongside your ingress resource in Kubernetes. And for those who are familiar, there's ingress controllers, right, that are like the most popular is Nginx ingress controller, that are used to kind of sit outside of your cluster to provide the necessary routes to the pods in your cluster. And so you create this ingress controller, which usually looks like a pod running in your Kubernetes cluster, but just kind of exposes that ingress point. And then the ingress resource, which is an actual API resource in Kubernetes, takes over from there to route it to the correct service and then the pods. But Gateway API works very much the same. And so you do have to know both ingress controllers and Gateway API to manage that traffic. I can't think of an example of what they may be asking in that case, being that it's such a kind of closed circuit environment in a lot of ways. I would imagine they would provide you with the kind of the Gateway API resource, if you will, the mechanism to, it's not like you're going to be spinning up a cloud instance, right? So I would imagine they would provide all that's necessary. Perhaps you're changing configuration, or it says manage, not create. So that's another indication that it's, managing existing resources that will be available to you for the exam, as opposed to, having to create these things. So.
Okay.
And that's it. So that's the additions to the exam. I would say Gateway API and the CRDs and operators are the biggest ones. Again, kind of a new concept for folks to learn and to understand. And I will be very, I will be very happy to create a new version of the book and yeah, just provide those updated information. So look out for that coming as soon as possible.
Well, I feel re-energized. I think I'm going to book the exam, right?
Oh, nice.
I'm going to call it out, right, on this show, because I like to make myself publicly accountable. We've both had a mentor that used to do that to us, right? So I think I'm gonna book the exam, and try and learn the new changes. I'm probably going to be reaching out to you, Chad, right, to get some hints and tips. But yeah, I think it's more pointed. The additions, like the language has changed, right, and the way that they're going, I think it's for the better, right? Like I think the wording's better, right, and the removal of the etcd, right, because that was a local database, right? Like you had to back up, because if that went, the whole thing would fall over, right, or whatever. So
yeah,
that being removed, I think, is a great thing. But is there any other resources or anything that you would recommend to folks, right, who want to get started? I know it's on the Linux Foundation, right, when you book the exam, not the CNCF, right? When I'm trying to book an exam. But like the curriculum's on there, like the exam curriculum, and it's got it'll have the changes in there, right, that are coming out as well. I did have one last question before I let you answer that first question, because it just popped into my head. But I remember that you used to be able to look up the docs, right, in the exam, if you forgot a command, or you want, I think it's this, right, but I needed more information. Are they still letting you do that? Or I'm not saying it was an open book exam, right, but it was like you could look up the README files, right, on most of the components for the exam.
Yeah. The reason why I don't highlight that, or it's not necessarily the first thing that I say, is because you only have 2 hours to complete 16 to 18 tasks, and those tasks could have 5 or 6 subtasks. So
right,
it's going to go by quickly. So I don't recommend leaning on having the documentation open. There are two resources that you can use for the exam. There's the Kubernetes documentation, so the official documentation, docs.kubernetes.io. And then there's the Kubernetes blog that's also available. And that's it. So you can have one tab open during the exam to either of those sites. you because you're in a kind of closed circuit environment, this RDP environment, if you try to go to any other site, it's firewalled, so it won't let you go to that, even if you wanted to. A lot of people ask me that just because they wonder, like, if I accidentally click on a link, because like you can search in the Kubernetes documentation, and sometimes the search has like links to the GitHub page or links to discuss, and so if they click on one of those links, they won't be marked off. They just won't be able to get to that page. So yeah, huge advantage, but don't necessarily want to lean on that as a resource, because it takes time.
I would concur with that. I when I was doing the exam, I forgot something and I was trying to go through the documentation. At that point, it should really be muscle memory, right? I'm not saying that you should be able to walk in and do it blindfolded, but you should know at least 90% of what you're trying to answer, right, during that exam question, rather than having to lean onto documentation or whatever reference. So I mean, that's a good point. It's 2 hours will fly by, especially when it's practical. Yeah.
One other thing that's important to remember is you do have a free retake. So
nice.
That's why I say the 6-month thing. And again, it totally depends on your background and your what prerequisite knowledge you have. I think that having the free retake in your back pocket is really powerful in a lot of ways. It allows people to feel not as afraid to schedule their exam in the first place, because a lot of people, it's funny how the human brain works, right? It's like you have the intent to take this exam, and you kind of push it off. I understand things come up, and that's totally fine. I'm not judging anybody here, but I'm just saying, like, just schedule it, because you have a free retake after that, which you can take the next day if you want. So it's really an advantage, because you get to essentially simulate the exam if you want, kind of go through a test round and then take the retake for free, which is always takes the pressure off a little bit,
Yeah, that's some big advice there. I think with any certification, like, book it, because if you don't book it, you won't commit yourself to it either, right? But like you said, you've got a second shot at it as well, right? If it goes wrong. So,
and that's why we do the boot camps and Cube Skills as well. Cube Skills with a K, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that, but yeah, that's why we do the boot camps, is to create that accountability. It's kind of like you said, you like to have, you're having some public accountability right now. So
oh yeah, I like putting the pressure on, right? But
yeah, so people who don't have their own podcast or are not available to announce it publicly, they have a group of people that are keeping them accountable, and also the advantage of practicing with other people, bouncing ideas off of other people, and the power of community is study group and all those things are tremendously beneficial to actually doing the exam and getting it done.
Awesome advice. So on a final note, Chad, where can people find you?
You can find me in my local community, which I want to highlight first and foremost, because I am not only a CNCF ambassador, but truly believe in kind of the power of community. I know that I keep saying that word, but just the power in terms of what you can accomplish and what how your career can advance when you involve yourself in your local community. Kevin, you have a local community where you live. I have one too. It's called Kubernetes Austin, and you can look up your local community on the CNCF website and find where everyone else is in your part of the world that they're also learning Kubernetes and learning the things that you're learning. So I have Kubernetes Austin. I have KCD, which is Kubernetes Community Days, which we're going to be having in the spring of next year in Austin. And then I would say jump right into involving yourself in the community. And so where else you can find me is on LinkedIn or Twitter, called X now. I'm basically everywhere at the I think it's on your screen. The
It is, yeah.
Chad M. Crowell is what my middle name is Michael, so Chad M as in Michael Crowell, and you can find me pretty much anywhere. I'm pretty available, and you can even Google my name, I think, and it'll be one of the top results. So I have a lot of content from when I was working at Linux Academy, which then became A Cloud Guru, which then became Pluralsight.
That's right. Yeah, it's gone through a couple of changes, right?
So you can, it's been a while since I worked there, but that's why I have such a kind of high SEO. But yeah, reach out and find me in the KubeSkills community, most importantly, where we'll be doing the boot camps and the learning lessons and the free resources that you can access to get up and running with just containers, open source, and Kubernetes. And we have lots of free resources in there, as well as the boot camps. So check that out and send me a direct message in there as well.
Awesome. I'll also include it in the show notes, right? So you'll be able to see it below, right? To make it a bit easier for folks. But again, Chad, I just want to say thanks for coming on. It's been a while it's been a minute since we've caught up, but I really appreciate you coming on and breaking down the exam changes, right? And making it more accessible for folks to try and take the exam as well. I think that's really important. I'm really big on community as well. Sharing the love, right? At the end of the day. So thank you very much.
One other thing, you're welcome, and thank you for having me. One other thing as we go, speaking of providing additional resources, because I don't think I answered that question before. On my GitHub page, and again, it's Chad M. Crowell. I have this repo called CKA exercises, and you can find links to Killer Shell, Killer Coda. You can look at some exam exercises, and that includes the exam changes as well that we talked about. So maybe that's a good resource for people to get more information if you want to learn more, if you're interested in taking the CKA, along with reaching out to me directly, which I have a lot of resources for you as well, and can kind of walk you through, like, if you're ready, or when should I take it, when should I schedule it, what should I do, sort of individual questions. That's a good resource as well.
Awesome. I'm going to take a look at that myself.
Nice.
Okay. Well, thanks. And I'll catch you on the next one.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. Bye.
Bye for now.
Yeah.